The Galvins really looked like the American dream. 12 children, a brilliant father working in aerospace, a devoted, meticulous mother who always made sure to have dinner on the table every single night. Really the kind of family you'd expect to see on a 1950s magazine cover. But behind the walls of their Colorado Springs home, something darker was unraveling. One son believed the CIA was spying on him. Another killed the family dog, convinced that it was possessed. There were years of shattered glass, broken doors, and blood on the walls.
I'm Mary Christine Galvin, which my mother always said was named after Mary, the mother of Christ. I was born into this large Irish Catholic family. I was the youngest of 12 children, 10 boys and 2 girls. Don, Jim, John, Brian, Michael, Richard, Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret, and Mary. 6 of my brothers diagnosed schizophrenics. There was something going on with Jim. Peter breaking all the windows in the house. Donald, he dismembered a dog in the bathtub at home.
In the spring of 1984, a researcher named Dr. Lynn DeLisi sat down with a family in Colorado and asked them for something most people would never agree to hand over: their blood. Not 1 or 2 of them, all of them. 12 children, born to the same 2 parents. And here's why she wanted it so badly. 6 of those children, 6 sons, had already been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The other 6, 4 brothers and 2 sisters, had not. Same parents, same house, same last name. And somehow, 1/2 of that family had gone on to live ordinary lives, while the other half had been swallowed up by one of the most devastating diseases in psychiatry. Now, understand something. The odds of schizophrenia striking any one person are about 1 in 100. One family in Colorado Springs had it strike 6 times. Doctors had never seen anything like it. And what Dr. DeLisi was hoping, what she was staking a good part of her career on, was that somewhere in the blood of this one family was a clue that could crack open the biology of schizophrenia itself. But here's the thing nobody could answer yet, not in 1984. Nobody knew what was actually in that blood. All they had was a mystery, and a mother who had already spent 30 years being quietly blamed for her son's illness, long before anybody ever thought to look at her DNA. Her name was Mimi Galvin. And to understand how her family ended up here, sitting for blood draws and becoming one of the most studied families in the history of American psychiatry, you have to go back. Back before the diagnoses. Back before anyone in Colorado Springs suspected a thing. It starts, like a lot of American families of that generation, with the Air Force. Don Galvin was a decorated Navy man who came home from the Pacific after the war and eventually found his way to the brand new United States Air Force Academy, where he worked as an instructor and helped train the school's Falcons, the same Falcons that became the Academy's mascot. He married Mimi, and between 1945 and 1965, the 2 of them had 12 children, 10 boys, then 2 girls. From the outside, the Galvins looked like a family you'd put in a recruiting brochure: a war hero father, an elegant mother, a house full of athletes and altar boys. Neighbors in Colorado Springs didn't just like the Galvins, they admired them. But a household that large, that tightly wound, was carrying more underneath it than any photograph could ever show. The oldest of the 12 was a boy named Donald. Big, athletic, deeply religious, the kind of son who made a father proud walking into church on a Sunday. He played football. He wrestled. By every outward measure, Donald Galvin was exactly the young man his parents believed they had raised. Nothing about him at 18 suggested he'd be the first domino to fall. But he was about to leave home for college, and somewhere between Colorado Springs and Colorado State University, that's exactly what he became. Donald's trouble didn't show up all at once. It showed up in pieces. The kind of pieces a family in the early 1960s simply didn't have a name for yet. At Colorado State, people who knew him started noticing things. One night, Donald walked straight into a bonfire, not stumbled, not fell, walked, and came out with serious burns nobody could explain. Then came an incident involving a dead cat that has followed the Galvin story for decades. Some retellings say Donald strangled the animal. The more carefully documented version says the cat was already dead and that Donald mutilated its body in a bathtub. Then he did something that matters a great deal to this story. He walked into the University Health Service on his own, and he told them exactly what he'd done. He wasn't bragging. By every account, he was scared of himself. Now, here's a detail that deserves your full attention. Donald asked for help. A young man walked in the door and said, in his own way, "Something is wrong with my mind." And the doctors who saw him sent him back out that same door with no diagnosis and no plan. That's not because nobody cared. It's because psychiatry, at that point in history, simply didn't have the tools to recognize early psychosis in a college kid who otherwise looked healthy. There was no test for it. There was no framework for it. There was just a frightened young man and a system that didn't know what to do with him. So, Donald went home unhelped, and over the next few years, his family watched him come apart in ways nobody had a word for. He married a young woman named Jean. The marriage didn't survive whatever was happening inside him. Then, in 1967 or 1968, the uncertainty that had hung over Donald for years ended for good. He attempted to kill his estranged wife using cyanide fumes. After that, there was no more wondering. Donald Galvin was diagnosed with schizophrenia and committed to the state mental hospital in Pueblo, Colorado. It was the first time that word schizophrenia had ever been spoken inside that family. It would not be the last. Over the years that followed, Donald would be admitted to Pueblo more than a dozen times. For a while, Don and Mimi could tell themselves this was one son's tragedy, one deeply troubled boy in one otherwise ordinary family. That story might have held together if it weren't for what was already starting down the hall. Jim was the second born, and he'd spent his whole childhood competing with Donald for every inch of attention in that crowded house. Where Donald had been the golden boy, Jim was the one who got expelled from school for sneaking onto an Air Force jet. Trouble, but the ordinary kind of trouble a teenage boy gets into. He grew up, got married, and had a son. For a little while Donald was falling apart, Jim actually looked like the brother who was going to be fine. Then the paranoia started. People watching him. People following him. A conspiracy closing in that existed nowhere except inside his own mind. Donald could still be explained away as one unlucky young man. Jim was about to make that a much harder story to believe. Jim's marriage didn't survive the voices in his head any more than Donald's had survived his. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, the second Galvin son to carry that word. And by now, a family that had told itself Donald was a one-time tragedy had to face a colder possibility. Maybe this had never been about Donald at all. Maybe it was about to happen again. It happened again in California, about as far from Hidden Valley Road as a Galvin son could get. Brian was the fourth born, and out of all 10 brothers, he was the one who seemed to have gotten out clean. A talented musician chasing a music career, magnetic, well-liked, seemingly nothing like his two struggling older brothers. But by 1973, a doctor somewhere had already prescribed Brian a first-generation antipsychotic medication called Navain. That single fact tells you something important. Somebody, at some point, had recognized real psychiatric symptoms in Brian, symptoms Brian was clearly hiding from the people who loved him most. On September 9, 1973, at 22 years old, Brian shot his girlfriend and then took his own life. Now, it's worth pausing here to say something plainly, because this is a moment where the story could easily be misused. What Brian did was an extreme, tragic outcome of untreated psychiatric illness in an era with almost no effective treatment for it. It is not what schizophrenia looks like for the overwhelming majority of people who live with it. The evidence actually runs the opposite direction of the stereotype. People with serious mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than they are to commit it. Brian's story is a tragedy inside this one family's history. It is not a description of the disease. 3 sons down, and the Galvins still had 6 more boys to watch. In 1975, Don Galvin suffered a stroke right in front of his family. Not long after, Peter, the 10th son, a sharp math student and a genuinely talented hockey player, began to fall apart. He started speaking in gibberish. He was wetting the bed as a teenager. He became violent in ways nobody could predict. The boy who, simply by being born last, should have had the best odds in that house, didn't get a pass either. Then came Matthew, the 9th son, a gifted young artist who had a psychotic break of his own in 1976. And finally, in 1982, at the age of 25, Joseph, the 7th son, the one who had seemed to be building a stable, ordinary adult life in Chicago, was diagnosed too. 6 sons: Donald, Jim, Brian, Peter, Matthew, Joseph. 6 diagnoses of schizophrenia inside one family out of 10 boys. What followed for these 6 brothers, decade after decade, was a grinding cycle of hospitalization, medication, and relapse. The treatments available at the time, first-generation antipsychotics and, in some cases, electroconvulsive therapy, could sometimes quiet the worst of the hallucinations and the paranoia. But they came nowhere close to giving these men their old lives back, and they carried a physical cost the family wouldn't fully understand for years to come. One thing made an already brutal situation even harder for Mimi and Don, and it's something modern medicine understands far better today than doctors did back then. 5 of the 6 affected brothers suffered from something called anosognosia, a neurological inability to recognize that anything was wrong with them at all. This isn't stubbornness. It isn't a grown son being difficult on purpose. It's a documented effect of the illness itself on the part of the brain responsible for self-awareness. To Don and Mimi at the time, it looked like their sons fighting them at every turn over medication and hospital visits. What it actually was biology. Sons who were too sick to know they were sick. 6 diagnoses. A family cracking under a weight almost no household in America had ever carried. And in 1984, the very moment we opened this story, the medical world already thought it had an answer for how this had happened. It didn't point to a virus. It didn't point to a gene. It pointed, almost entirely, at one person, Mimi. For most of the 20th century, American psychiatry believed something that sounds almost unbelievable today, that schizophrenia could be caused by a mother. It even had a name, the schizophrenogenic mother, a term coined by a psychoanalyst named Frieda Fromm-Reichmann back in the late 1940s. The theory claimed that a certain kind of mother, cold, controlling, smothering, could essentially manufacture schizophrenia in her own children through bad parenting alone. A related idea called the double bind theory argued that confusing, contradictory messages from parents could fracture a child's mind from the inside. Neither theory was ever backed by solid evidence. Both of them were taken seriously by doctors for decades anyway. And Mimi Galvin, a woman raising 12 children largely on her own while her husband worked constantly, fit the profile almost too perfectly. She was exacting. She was protective, sometimes fiercely so. She insisted, in public and in private, that everything in her house was fine. To a psychiatrist looking for a controlling mother, Mimi practically checked every box on the list. Here's the problem with that theory, though, and it's worth sitting with for a second. As her sons got sicker, Mimi, understandably, tried to hold the household together even harder, and doctors looked at that same effort, a mother fighting to keep her family from falling apart, and used it as proof that she'd caused the falling apart in the first place. It's blame that feeds on itself. The sicker her sons became, the more guilty she looked. Now, none of this means the Galvin house was some kind of peaceful, misunderstood home that psychiatry simply got wrong about. It wasn't. There was real damage inside those walls, and the family eventually had to face it. As adults, both Donald and Jim revealed that they had been sexually abused as children by a local priest who had been welcomed into the Galvin home as a trusted family friend. And there is a second, even harder truth in this family's history. Jim, in the years before his own diagnosis, sexually abused his two much younger sisters, Margaret and the sister who would later rename herself Lindsay, over a period of years. So, for a moment, it's fair to ask, maybe this explains it. Maybe six brothers didn't need a gene at all. Maybe raw trauma, on its own, was enough to break this many minds in one house. Except it wasn't, because the two girls who survived that abuse, Margaret and Lindsay, never developed schizophrenia. Neither did the four other Galvin brothers who grew up in that same overwhelmed house, under that same exhausted mother, breathing the same air as their six sick brothers. If trauma alone were the whole answer, it should have broken all 12 of them, or at the very least, a lot more than 6. This is where modern medicine actually lands on the Galvin family, and it's a more complicated answer than either of the old theories offered. Doctors today use something called the diathesis stress model to explain cases like this one. In plain terms, it means a person can inherit a biological vulnerability to a disease like schizophrenia, and that vulnerability can sit quietly for years, doing nothing, unless it's triggered by enough outside stress. Trauma, substance use, a brutal childhood. None of those things create schizophrenia out of nothing. But in someone who is already carrying that hidden vulnerability, they can be exactly what tips the scale. So, the real question stopped being who is to blame. It became something much harder to answer, and something no psychiatrist in 1970 had the tools to even ask. What exactly was that vulnerability? And where in this family was it hiding? The answer to that question was already sitting in a lab, in vials of blood the Galvins had agreed, years earlier, to give away. That blood didn't turn into an answer right away, not even close. Dr. DeLisi's idea, back in the early 1980s, was that instead of chasing schizophrenia through thousands of strangers who happened to share a diagnosis, researchers would learn more from a family like the Galvins, a big family, with several people affected and several people not, all sharing the same genetic starting point. It's a smart idea. It's also a slow one. The technology scientists had in 1984 simply wasn't good enough yet to read a genome the way it can today. There were a few false starts along the way. In 1999, researchers looking at the Galvin family found a small missing piece on chromosome 22, a deletion that had already been linked to schizophrenia risk in other studies. For a moment, that looked promising, but it wasn't the kind of finding that could explain 6 brothers on its own, and the search kept going. It wasn't until 2016, more than 30 years after Mimi first rolled up her sleeve for Dr. DeLisi, that whole genome sequencing, a technology that didn't even exist back in 1984, finally turned up something specific. Working with researchers including Stephen McDonough, DeLisi's team found a rare mutation in a gene called SHANK2 sitting on chromosome 11, present in the Galvin sons who had schizophrenia. Here's what SHANK2 actually does, in plain English. Every connection between two brain cells, every synapse, needs a kind of scaffolding to hold the working parts in place so signals can pass from one cell to the next cleanly. SHANK2 is one of the proteins that builds that scaffolding. The mutation the Galvins carried sat right in the piece of the protein responsible for holding other pieces together. This wasn't a gene about mood, or personality, or willpower. It was a gene about the physical wiring of the brain. For the first time, 30 years of searching had produced something concrete. And for a moment, it looked like the case might actually be closed. Then came the detail that changed everything about what this discovery meant. When researchers looked more closely at who else in the family carried this mutation, they found it in someone nobody expected. Mimi. Mimi Galvin, the woman blamed for decades for supposedly causing her son's illness through cold, controlling parenting, turned out to be the one who had passed down a real, physical, biological vulnerability. And she had never developed schizophrenia herself. Neither had at least one of her daughters, who also carried the mutation. Sit with that for a second, because it's the whole story in one sentence. The woman's psychiatry spent 30 years accusing of manufacturing her son's illness through bad mothering, turned out to be carrying the actual biological thread running through this family. And the same discovery that finally proved her innocent of the old accusation also proved that having the gene was never by itself a guarantee of getting sick. Scientists have a term for this: incomplete penetrance. It means a person can carry a mutation connected to a disease and simply never develop that disease. Shank 2 raised the risk. It didn't hand down a sentence. This matters because it changes the whole shape of the mystery. Schizophrenia, researchers now understand, is heavily inherited. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of the risk is genetic, but it's rarely one single gene doing all the work. Most people's risk comes from hundreds of small genetic variants adding up together. In a family like the Galvins, with an unusually strong pattern, a rare variant like Shank 2 can carry more weight than it would in most other families. But even there, it still wasn't acting alone. There's one more layer researchers noticed, and they're careful not to overstate it. It's possible that being female offered the Galvin women who carried the mutation some additional biological protection, something related to hormones or how genes get expressed differently between men and women. That's still just a working theory. Nobody's proven it. What is proven is this: the mother once blamed for a psychological crime she never committed had, in fact, handed her son something real. And that same discovery undid the tidy, simple explanation almost as fast as it created it. A single gene, even a real one sitting in real DNA, couldn't tell you who would get sick and who wouldn't. So, the question this documentary opened with gets sharper, not simpler. If the mutation shows up in people who never develop psychosis, then something else has to be tipping the scale for the 6 brothers who did. And to find that something else, researchers were about to stop reading DNA and start listening to what was actually happening inside the Galvin brothers' brains. Around the same years DeLisi was chasing genes, a researcher at the University of Colorado named Robert Friedman was chasing something different. Not which gene was involved, but what that gene, or genes like it, actually did inside a working brain. Friedman focused on something called sensory gating, which is really just a fancy name for a basic job your brain does every single day without you noticing. Your brain is constantly flooded with information, sounds, sights, sensations, and most of it doesn't matter. A healthy brain learns to turn the volume down on anything repetitive so you can pay attention to what's actually new. Friedman's research suggested that in people with schizophrenia, that volume knob doesn't work the way it should. He tested this with something called the P50 test. 2 clicking sounds, played about half a second apart, while researchers measure the brain's electrical response to each one. In most people, the brain barely reacts to the second click because it already knows what's coming. In many people with schizophrenia, the brain reacts to that second click almost as strongly as it reacted to the first. The filter simply isn't filtering. Now, that doesn't mean the Galvin brothers walked around unable to block out any noise at all. It means researchers found a specific, measurable difference in how their brains processed repeated information, one piece of a bigger picture. And here's the part that connects right back to what we just learned about the Shank 2 gene. Friedman's team found this same sensory gating problem not just in the brothers who were sick, but in roughly half of their close relatives too, including some who never developed schizophrenia at all. Sound familiar? A biological marker showing up in people without the full illness. Same pattern as the gene, vulnerability you can measure without a guaranteed outcome. Friedman traced this gating problem to a gene called CHRNA7, which builds a receptor in the brain that responds to a chemical called acetylcholine. That receptor sits on brain cells whose job is to calm other cells down, helping the brain quiet a repeated signal instead of treating it like brand new information every time. In people with schizophrenia, there are roughly half as many of these receptors as there should be. It's also part of why so many people with schizophrenia are heavy smokers. Nicotine can temporarily wake up the receptors that are left, though the effect fades quickly, and it isn't something anyone should mistake for treatment. Friedman's research eventually pushed backward, from grown men in psychiatric hospitals to babies who hadn't even been born yet. Those same receptors get built during pregnancy, and they need a nutrient called choline to develop properly. So, Friedman and other researchers ran studies giving pregnant women extra choline, roughly double the normal amount, and measuring how their newborns' brains handled that same click test. The results were encouraging. Babies whose mothers got extra choline during pregnancy showed better early signs of that filtering ability than babies who didn't. That finding is a big part of why the American Medical Association now recommends choline as part of prenatal care for pregnant women across the country. Let's be careful and honest about what that does and doesn't mean. Nobody is saying choline prevents schizophrenia. Nobody can say that. What the research shows is narrower and still remarkable. Some of the biology connected to this disease may begin taking shape long before birth, which means some of the earliest opportunities to help may exist long before anyone could ever see a symptom. 60 years after Donald Galvin walked into a college health clinic and got sent home with no diagnosis and no help, medicine has traveled from a frightened young man in a waiting room to a strand of DNA, to a single receptor, to a recommendation now given to millions of pregnant women who have never heard the Galvin name and never will. None of that research changed what had already happened to the 6 Galvin brothers themselves. Donald spent most of his adult life in and out of the state hospital in Pueblo, and he lived out his final years in a long-term care facility not far from there. Matthew, the artist, is still alive today in a care facility in Colorado Springs. Peter, the hockey player and math student, died in October 2023. Jim and Joseph both died at 53, and in both cases, the cause was heart failure connected to the very antipsychotic medications that had also kept the worst of their symptoms under some kind of control. That's the brutal trade the era's medicine offered this family. The drugs could quiet the voices. They could also, slowly, over years, damage the heart. Medicine has moved a long way past those older drugs. In September of 2024, the FDA approved a new schizophrenia medication called Cobenfy, and it works completely differently from every antipsychotic that came before it. For 70 years, every schizophrenia drug worked by blocking dopamine. Cobenfy doesn't touch dopamine directly at all. It works through a different chemical system in the brain, one connected to the same acetylcholine receptors Robert Friedman spent his career studying. It isn't a Galvin family invention, and it isn't free of side effects of its own, but it's real evidence that after decades of one single approach to this disease, science is finally looking through more than one door. So, what actually explains the Galvins? After 40 years of blood samples, gene sequencing, click tests, and choline trials, here's where the evidence lands. Schizophrenia is heavily inherited. The Galvin brothers carried a real, physical, biological vulnerability passed down through Mimi. That vulnerability showed up not just in one gene, but in measurable brain function too. And on top of all of that biology, this particular family also lived through real trauma, real chaos, and real loss. But no single one of those things, not the gene, not the sensory gating deficit, not the trauma, fully explains why 6 brothers became sick and 6 of their siblings never did. Medicine still can't answer that with total certainty. And that unresolved gap isn't a failure of this story. It's the most important thing the Galvin family ever handed to science. The 6 children who stayed well are just as much a part of the answer as the 6 who didn't. Their lives prove that shared blood, shared trauma, and a shared house still don't guarantee a shared outcome. Lindsay, the youngest of the 12, ended up carrying more of this story than anyone. She became the legal caretaker for her surviving brothers, and years later, she helped bring this family's history into the world, first through a best-selling book and then through a documentary series. When that series aired, she publicly pushed back on how it handled her family, saying it leaned hard into the violence and the abuse, while giving almost no room to something she considered essential: the fact that her brothers, for most of their illness, physically could not recognize they were sick at all. That's not defiance, that's a symptom, and without understanding that one detail, almost everything else about this family is easy to misread. She's also been clear about one more thing. Her brothers were never only their diagnosis. Donald was an athlete and a deeply religious young man before any of this began. Brian played music. Matthew made art good enough that people wanted to own it. Peter could do math most adults couldn't. The Galvins never handed medicine one clean answer. They handed it something more honest than that. Proof that a disease this old, this devastating, and this misunderstood has never been simple, and that, because one family kept giving away their blood for 40 straight years, it is a little less of a mystery than it used to be. If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely like to know what you think explains it: the genes, the trauma, or something science still hasn't found. Drop it in the comments below, and if you want more real, carefully researched stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more families out there whose stories deserve to be told right.